No one had ever looked at her without calculating her worth first. The rancher's daughter pressed her palm against the barn wood, feeling splinters bite deeper than the whispers that followed her through town. Half-blood, neither white enough for the church ladies nor Indian enough for her mother's ghost. When the Comanche warrior's eyes found hers across the trading post, she saw something that made her chest crack open like drought-starved earth meeting rain. Not calculation, not disgust. Something that looked dangerously close to recognition. "No one ever looked at me with kindness," she would whisper later, not knowing that kindness could be the cruelest weapon of all. Sarah May Thornton had learned to read faces the way other women read scripture, searching for salvation in expressions that promised only judgment. At 19, she carried herself like an apology, shoulders curved inward, as if she could fold herself small enough to disappear into the spaces between other people's expectations. Her father's ranch stretched across the Texas plains like a scar, all dust and broken promises, and she moved through it like a ghost haunting her own life. The Mexican workers spoke to her in Spanish when her father wasn't watching, their voices soft with the kind of pity that cut deeper than hatred. They saw her mother in the copper of her skin, in the way her black hair caught light like obsidian, and they remembered the Comanche woman who had died birthing this child caught between worlds. The morning sun painted the horizon the color of dried blood, and Sarah May stood at the kitchen window watching her father's cattle move like dark thoughts across the pasture. Thomas Thornton had built his fortune on stolen land and borrowed time, his weathered hands counting coins, while his daughter counted the ways she had failed to be the son he wanted, or the white daughter he could display with pride. She had heard him tell visitors that her mother died of fever, never mentioning the Comanche raids or the woman who had chosen love over loyalty to her tribe. The lie sat between them at every meal, heavy as the silence that filled their house like smoke from a fire that never quite died. Her reflection in the window showed her the truth he tried to hide. High cheekbones that spoke of wind and horses, eyes dark as midnight on the plains, skin that would never be pale enough to erase her mother's legacy. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart stutter against her ribs like a trapped bird. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer, their silhouettes wavering like mirages against the endless sky. She recognized the sheriff's bulk, the way he sat his horse like a man who had never questioned his right to judge others, and beside him rode 2 men whose faces she couldn't make out, but whose purpose she could feel in the tension that suddenly filled the air. Her father appeared from the barn, his movement sharp with the kind of anger that had been building for weeks, and she watched through the glass as words were exchanged like bullets, quick and deadly. The sheriff's voice carried on the wind, something about missing cattle and Indian raids, and she saw her father's eyes cut toward the house where she stood watching. Fear crawled up her spine like a cold finger, and she stepped back from the window as if the glass could protect her from the accusations she felt building in the air like a storm. She had done nothing wrong, but guilt was a luxury she had never been allowed. Her very existence was crime enough in a world that demanded she choose sides in a war that had started before her birth. The riders stayed for 20 minutes that felt like hours, their horses stamping and snorting, while the men talked in voices too low for her to hear, but loud enough to make her stomach clench with dread. When they finally rode away, dust trailing behind them like the ghosts of all the words left unspoken, her father stood in the yard for a long time, his shoulders set against a weight she knew she had helped create. That evening, as she served him supper in the silence that had become their only shared language, she caught him studying her face with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem that had no good solution. His fork scraped against the plate like fingernails on wood, and she wondered if he was calculating how much easier his life would be without the constant reminder of his choices walking through his house. The beans grew cold on her plate as she waited for him to speak, to finally say the words that had been building between them like pressure in a kettle. Instead, he pushed back from the table and walked out into the night, leaving her alone with the weight of all the things that could never be unsaid. She cleared the dishes with hands that trembled like leaves in a wind that promised storms, and as she stood at the sink, watching the last light fade from the sky, she whispered a prayer to a God who had never seemed particularly interested in half-blood daughters. Tomorrow would bring new whispers, new accusations, new reasons for her to apologize for the crime of existing in a world that had no place for women like her. But tonight, in the safety of her father's house that felt more like a prison with each passing day, she allowed herself to dream of a place where kindness wasn't rationed like water in a drought, where someone might look at her and see something worth saving instead of something that needed to be explained away. The trading post squatted on the edge of town like a wounded animal, its weathered boards grey as old bones under the merciless Texas sun. Sarah May had ridden in alone, her father's warnings echoing in her ears like the sound of distant thunder, but necessity had driven her past fear into the realm of desperate hope. They needed supplies, and Thomas Thornton's pride wouldn't let him show his face in town, while whispers of cattle theft and Indian sympathies followed his name like buzzards circling carrion. She tied her mare to the hitching post with fingers that shook despite her efforts to appear calm, knowing that every eye in the settlement would mark her arrival and file it away for future judgment. The wooden steps creaked under her boots like the bones of something long dead, and she pushed through the door into the dim interior where shadows gathered like secrets in the corners. The smell hit her first. Leather and tobacco, sweat and whiskey, the particular musk of men who had ridden hard and slept rough under stars that offered no comfort. She kept her eyes down as she moved toward the counter, her mother's training whispering in her blood to make herself small, invisible, unthreatening to the predators that measured her worth in glances sharp as knife blades. Behind the counter, old Pete Morrison watched her with the expression of a man who had seen too much and forgiven too little, his rheumy eyes cataloguing her features like evidence in a trial she hadn't known she was facing. The other customers, 3 cowboys whose faces she didn't recognize, and a buffalo hunter whose smell preceded him like a warning, fell silent as she approached, their conversation dying like embers in rain. She had just opened her mouth to speak when the door opened again, letting in a shaft of sunlight that seemed to set the dust motes dancing like spirits in the air. The man who entered moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to walk silently across ground that might betray him, and she felt the temperature in the room drop as if winter had suddenly claimed the Texas plains. He was Comanche. She knew it in her bones before her eyes confirmed what her blood had already recognized. Tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from living close to death and closer to the land. His dark hair hung loose around shoulders that had never bent under the weight of another man's expectations, and when his gaze swept the room, she saw the other men shrink back like flowers closing against frost. Their eyes met across the space that suddenly felt charged as the air before lightning, and Sarah May felt something crack open in her chest, like ice breaking on a river in spring. He looked at her, not with the calculation she had learned to expect, not with the mixture of desire and disgust that white men wore when they thought her father wasn't watching, but with something that made her breath catch in her throat like a sob. Recognition. Not of her face, which he had never seen, but of something deeper, the particular loneliness that came from walking between worlds that claimed you belonged to neither. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she forgot to be afraid, forgot to make herself small, forgot everything except the way his dark eyes seemed to see straight through to the part of her that had never learned to apologize for existing. The spell broke when Pete Morrison's voice cut through the silence like an axe through kindling, harsh and unforgiving as the land that had shaped them all. "We don't serve your kind here," he said, his hand moving toward the shotgun that rested beneath the counter like a sleeping snake. The Comanche warrior's expression didn't change, But Sarah May saw something flicker in his eyes, not fear, but a weariness that spoke of too many doors slammed, too many hands reaching for weapons, too many times being told he didn't belong in places where his people had walked for generations before white men ever dreamed of Texas. The cowboys shifted restlessly, hands drifting toward gun belts with the nervous energy of men who had been waiting for an excuse to prove their courage against an enemy they could finally see. But it was Sarah May who moved first, stepping forward before her mind could catch up with her heart, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "He's with me," she said, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water, sending ripples through the room that would reach shores she couldn't imagine. The lie tasted like copper and hope on her tongue, and she saw the warrior's eyes widen slightly, surprise flickering across features that had been carved by wind and hardship into something beautiful and terrible. Pete Morrison's face went red as a turkey's wattle, and she knew that in speaking those 3 words, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had chosen a side in a war that would now claim her as surely as it had claimed her mother before her. The days that followed moved like wounded animals, slow and bleeding across the endless expanse of her father's land. Margaret found herself walking the same paths her mother had once walked, her feet finding the worn grooves in the earth where another woman's desperation had carved permanent scars into the prairie. The house seemed to breathe differently now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed her confession and were slowly exhaling the poison of truth into every corner where shadows gathered like conspirators. She could feel her father's eyes following her movements, tracking her like a predator tracks prey, waiting for the moment when her betrayal would reveal itself in some gesture, some glance toward the horizon where the Comanche camps lay hidden beyond the mesquite and sage. The morning sun painted the kitchen in shades of amber and regret as Margaret prepared her father's breakfast, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind wandered to places it had no business going. She could still feel the phantom weight of Ayana's fingers against her palm, could still taste the salt of tears that had fallen like rain onto parched earth, and the memory made her fingers tremble as she poured coffee into the chipped ceramic mug that had belonged to her mother. Her father sat at the table like a monument to masculine authority, his presence filling the room with the kind of silence that demanded confession, that pulled secrets from hiding places like a magnet draws iron filings from sand. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of judgment already rendered, the tone of a man who had made his peace with violence long before his daughter had learned to walk. "There's been talk in town," he said, his words falling into the morning air like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every shore. Talk about Indian raids getting closer, about settlers going missing in the night, about the need for men to band together and show these savages what happens when they forget their place. Margaret felt her heart contract like a fist closing around broken glass, felt the sharp edges of fear cutting into the tender places where hope had been trying to take root. She knew that when her father spoke of showing savages their place, he was speaking of death, of the kind of systematic elimination that had already claimed so many lives on both sides of a war that seemed to have no beginning and promised no end. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap at the slightest provocation, and Margaret found herself holding her breath as if the very act of breathing might somehow betray the secret that was burning like acid in her chest. She thought of Ayana's face in the moonlight, of the way sorrow had carved itself into the landscape of her features, of the terrible beauty that existed in the space between two worlds that would never learn to coexist. Her father's eyes were studying her with the intensity of a man reading scripture, searching for signs and portents in the curve of her shoulders, The set of her jaw, the way her hands moved as she busied herself with tasks that suddenly seemed monumentally important. When she finally met his gaze, she saw something there that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Not suspicion, but certainty, the look of a man who had already decided what needed to be done. "I've sent word to the territorial marshal," he continued, his voice carrying the finality of a coffin lid closing, the sound of earth being thrown onto something that would never see daylight again. "There's going to be a reckoning, Margaret. And when it comes, every person in this territory is going to have to choose which side of the line they're standing on." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Margaret felt something inside her chest begin to crack like ice under the weight of spring, felt the careful architecture of her secret life beginning to crumble under the pressure of a truth that could no longer be contained. She knew that her father wasn't just talking about the war between settlers and Comanche. He was talking about the war between loyalty and love, between the safety of conformity and the terrible courage required to choose compassion over hatred. As the morning dissolved into afternoon, Margaret found herself standing at the edge of her father's property, staring out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of grass and possibility. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, carried the whispered promises of a world beyond the boundaries of hatred and fear, and she felt her heart pulling toward that horizon like a compass needle seeking true north. She knew that somewhere out there, Ayana was probably standing at the edge of her own world, staring back across the same expanse of land, feeling the same terrible weight of love that had no place to exist in a world determined to destroy anything that dared to bridge the gap between us and them. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and Margaret whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, a prayer for courage, for wisdom, for the strength to choose love over safety when the moment of reckoning finally arrived. 3 nights later, the sound came like thunder rolling across the prairie, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, amplified until it filled every corner of the darkness with its relentless rhythm. Margaret woke to the sound of hoofbeats, dozens of them, moving fast across the hardpan toward the house, and she knew with the terrible certainty of prophecy that the reckoning her father had promised was arriving ahead of schedule. She pressed her face to the window and saw them in the moonlight, a posse of men from town, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats, their rifles glinting like silver teeth in the pale light that filtered down from a sky full of indifferent stars. Her father was already moving through the house like a man who had been expecting this moment, his boots striking the wooden floors with the measured cadence of a funeral march, his presence filling the darkness with the kind of authority that comes from years of making decisions that other men are too weak to make. The men gathered in the yard like a pack of wolves, their horses snorting and stamping in the cool night air, their voices carrying the low murmur of violence being planned and justified in equal measure. Margaret could hear fragments of conversation drifting up through the floorboards, words like cleansing and final solution and making examples, and each word fell into her consciousness like a drop of poison, spreading through her system until her entire body felt contaminated by the proximity to such casual hatred. She watched through the crack in her bedroom door as her father descended the stairs, watched him join the circle of men in the yard, watched him nod his approval as plans were made for what they were calling a preemptive strike against the Comanche camps that lay hidden in the canyons beyond the eastern ridge. The leader of the posse was a man named Hutchins, a territorial judge whose interpretation of justice had always leaned heavily toward the final and irreversible kind, and his voice carried the weight of legal authority as he outlined the plan that would unfold with the dawn. They would ride hard and fast toward the canyon where scouts had reported seeing smoke from Comanche fires, would surround the camp before the sun cleared the horizon, would offer no quarter and accept no surrender, Because, as Hutchins explained with the cold logic of a man who had never looked into the eyes of the people he was condemning, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and it's time we stopped pretending otherwise. Margaret felt her heart stop beating for a moment, felt the world tilt on its axis as the full horror of what was being planned settled into her consciousness like sediment settling to the bottom of a poisoned well. She thought of Ayana sleeping peacefully in whatever shelter the Comanche had built in that distant canyon, thought of her waking to the sound of gunfire and screaming, thought of those dark eyes closing forever without ever again reflecting the light of kindness that had been so rare in both their worlds. The image hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over with a pain so intense it felt like her ribs were cracking, like her heart was being squeezed in a fist made of barbed wire and broken promises. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out, pressed her face against the cool wood of the door frame, and felt something inside her chest begin to transform, felt the careful girl she had always been dying and something fiercer, something more dangerous, being born in the space where innocence used to live. The men were mounting their horses now, checking their weapons with the methodical precision of butchers preparing for a busy day. And Margaret knew that she had perhaps an hour before they reached the canyon, perhaps an hour to choose between the safety of silence and the terrible risk of action. She thought of her mother's diary, of the words that had been written in desperation and hidden away like seeds waiting for the right season to grow, and she understood now that this was her season, that this was the moment when she would either become the woman her mother had dreamed of being or remain forever the daughter her father had shaped her to be. The sound of hoofbeats was already fading into the distance, carrying death toward the horizon like a plague wind, and Margaret felt her feet moving toward the stairs before her mind had fully processed the decision that was about to change everything. In the stable, her father's fastest horse stood waiting like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying, and as Margaret threw the saddle across its back with hands that shook like leaves in a storm wind, she whispered the words that would serve as both benediction and battle cry for the ride that lay ahead. No one ever looked at me with kindness, but I will not let kindness die while I still have breath to carry it forward. The horse beneath her was already moving before she had fully settled into the saddle, already racing toward the eastern ridge where dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of hope and terror, and Margaret felt herself becoming something new with every hoofbeat that carried her closer to a confrontation that would either save the woman she loved or destroy them both in the trying. The canyon opened before her like a wound in the earth, its red walls rising toward a sky that was just beginning to blush with the first hints of dawn, and Margaret could see the thin wisps of smoke rising from the Comanche camp, like prayers ascending toward gods who had grown tired of answering. Her horse was lathered with sweat and foam, its sides heaving like bellows as she pushed it down the narrow trail that switched back through the rocks and sage, and she could hear the distant sound of the posse behind her, still perhaps 20 minutes away, but closing fast like a storm front moving across the prairie. The camp below was just beginning to stir with the quiet movements of people greeting another day, unaware that it might be their last, and Margaret felt her heart breaking and reforming with each breath as she realized that she was about to shatter the peace of this hidden world with news that would turn their morning into nightmare. She found Ayana by the small stream that ran through the heart of the canyon, kneeling beside the water, with her long black hair falling like a curtain around her shoulders, and for a moment Margaret forgot about the approaching danger, forgot about everything except the way the early light seemed to gather around this woman, like she was something sacred, something worth dying for. When Ayana looked up and saw her, the surprise in her dark eyes quickly gave way to understanding, the kind of understanding that passes between people who have learned to read danger in the set of shoulders, the rhythm of breathing, the way someone sits a horse when they're carrying news that will change everything. Margaret slid from her saddle and ran to where Ayana was rising from the water's edge, and when their hands touched, she felt the electric shock of connection that reminded her why she had risked everything to be here. "They're coming," Margaret whispered, the words falling from her lips like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread through the camp like wildfire. "My father, the marshal, maybe 30 men with rifles and rope and the kind of hatred that doesn't ask questions before it starts killing." Ayana's face went very still, very calm, the way water goes still before it freezes, and Margaret could see her mind working behind those dark eyes, calculating distances and possibilities, weighing the lives of her people against the minutes they had left before the world exploded into violence. Around them, the camp was beginning to respond to some invisible signal, people moving with the fluid efficiency of those who had learned that survival often depended on the ability to disappear like smoke when the wind changed direction. "How long?" Ayana asked, her voice carrying the weight of leadership, the tone of someone who had been making life-and-death decisions since before she was old enough to understand their full cost. And Margaret felt a stab of admiration for this woman, who could face the end of everything with such steady grace. 20 minutes, maybe less," Margaret replied, watching as Ayana's expression shifted from calm to something harder, something that reminded Margaret that this woman was not just beautiful and kind, but also dangerous, also capable of the kind of violence that survival sometimes demanded. The sound of voices was rising from the camp now, urgent but controlled, the sound of people who had practiced this dance of disappearance many times before, and Margaret realized that she was witnessing something that few white people had ever seen, the Comanche preparing to vanish into the landscape like they had never existed at all. "You have to go," Ayana said, her hands gripping Margaret's shoulders with a strength that spoke of years spent handling horses and weapons and the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. "If they find you here, if they know you warned us, your father will—" But Margaret was already shaking her head, already stepping closer to this woman who had become the center of her universe in the space of a few stolen moments, already making the choice that would define the rest of whatever life she had left. "I'm not going back," she said, the words coming from some deep place inside her chest, some place where courage lived alongside terror and somehow managed to be stronger. "I can't go back to that house, to that life, to pretending that love is something to be ashamed of while hatred gets to wear the mask of righteousness." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer now, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder, and Ayana's people were melting away into the rocks and shadows with the practiced ease of water flowing around stones. But Ayana herself remained, her hands still gripping Margaret's shoulders, her eyes searching Margaret's face for something. Confirmation, perhaps, or absolution, or simply the courage to believe that love could survive in a world determined to destroy it. "If you stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's no going back, no safety, no forgiveness from the world we're leaving behind." Margaret felt tears starting to flow down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of finally choosing truth over safety, of finally becoming the woman her mother had dreamed of being, but had never found the courage to become. "Then we'll make our own world," Margaret whispered back. And as the first rifle shots began to echo through the canyon, as the posse discovered an empty camp and the cold ashes of fires that had been extinguished before dawn, 2 women disappeared into the vast wilderness of the American West, carrying nothing but love and the terrible, beautiful courage required to choose each other over everything else the world had to offer.